Hello, my name is Father Tighe, and this is our 57th segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross. And we go to our screen and we see the martyrdom of James breaks open light on the eternal high priesthood of Jesus foreshadowed by Melchizedeck in Genesis. In this segment, we emphasize the transition from the natural, the limits and boundaries, into the eternal order. And we go to our next screen and we see James' martyrdom at the temple. The temple is where they offered animals, and now James is offered. It caused many to see him as a priest connected to the temple and also connected to presiding at the Last Supper meal for the Christian community, what they were called Nazarenes in Jerusalem. James's holiness helped many feel God's presence, and they felt that's what the temple was all about, feeling God's presence. Paul agrees. He hears of all this, and he hears the martyrdom in 62 of James, and he's thinking, and he hears the thoughts from the community, and he writes an epistle written for Hebrew-speaking Jews. So he's writing for the Hebrew-speaking Jews in Hebrew. He sees Jesus as high priest with James in a new priesthood. Now, we haven't been emphasizing this up to now, even if mentioning it. The epistle was later translated for Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria, and later on when Peter and Paul are martyred, it comes back to Rome to make sense out of the martyrdom of Peter and Paul in Rome. We go on now to our next screen. Paul begins all of this by recalling Melchizedeck, the priest of the covenant of promise God made with Abraham. Paul sees James within the order of the eternal priesthood of Jesus, the high priest, which was foreshadowed by Melchizedek. Now we go to the next screen to Genesis. We go to Genesis 12, where the plan of salvation begins. Before Genesis 12, we only have the original sin story and the flood story, okay? But we're right in the early part of Genesis. We go to chapter 14, when Abram, his name hasn't been changed to Abraham yet, returned from his victory. He had a victory over some pagan priest. Out of nowhere comes this Melchizedek, king of Salem, and he brought out bread and wine. Now, up until now, bread and wine didn't make sense, but now we're connecting it to the bread and wine of Jesus and the bread and wine at the Last Supper meal James celebrated. And being a king of God, Most High, he blessed him. He blessed Abram. Blessed be Abram by God's Most High, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your foes into your hands. Now, Abram responds by giving him 10% of everything, which begins the tithing tradition. And the tithing tradition gives legitimacy to Melchizedek. And he said, this truly is a priest from God on high. Now we go to our next screen. And in our next screen, we see in the epistle to the Hebrews. Now we've gone from Genesis 14 to Paul's letter to the Hebrews. Chapter 4, verse 14. Since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our beliefs. Now, Paul is realizing more about the crucifixion and our faith, and he says, let us not be afraid to hold on to these beliefs. They're incredible to think about, God lifting us up into the eternal order. And so we confidently approach the throne of grace to receive grace and mercy. Now we realize, and it's been there, but more conscious, the Last Supper unites heaven and earth through presence of Jesus. Now in Genesis it begins, God created the heavens and earth, and original sin split the heavens and the earth. Now Jesus has brought them together. We shouldn't be afraid to enter into God's presence, enter into the throne of grace in the eternal order. We go to our next screen. Our beliefs conform also with the Psalms which are sung at the temple. It was not Christ glorifying himself as high priest, but rather the one in the Old Testament is God. God is the one who said, you are my son. Now, Paul is emphasizing that the Psalms connect the Son of God with Melchizedek. This day I have begotten you, which is Psalm 2, verse 7. He says in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, which joins Jesus and the order of Melchizedek in the eternal order. We go to our next screen. Paul stops and he says, we have much to say, but it is hard to explain. So he feels like I do and you do as I try to explain this to you. Solid food is for the mature. All right. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul says, I can only feed you milk. You're not ready for solid food. Now, when he's writing to the Hebrews, he expects more of them. He says, you're ready for solid food. He says, those with faculties trained to discern good and evil, let us leave basic teachings about Christ behind and advance to maturity. What is maturity? Maturity is when a plant, an animal, a human being becomes a life giver. That transformation that transforms us from children to life givers. We have the seed of life in us. This means are you ready, participating in this course, the light of the cross? Are you ready to advance with us and leave behind the basics and advance into a higher order, the eternal order? We go to our next screen. And in the next few verses, Paul says, this we have to anchor the soul. We have to be confident in our faith. And we have to allow the soul to hold us together as our faith lifts our hearts and our minds to the higher eternal order. It clears our minds of the limits and boundaries of the law, of our education, and of our natural instincts to allow God to lift us into the eternal order, joining heaven and earth, joining us with eternal life. And we go on there, and it says there, it reaches behind the veil. The veil in the temple symbolized the veil over our minds that prevents us from entering into God's presence in the eternal order. And Jesus broke through that veil, and every time he comes in the Eucharist, with James or somebody else presiding, we enter into the eternal order to clear our minds to enter into the eternal order. It says, where Jesus entered for our sake as high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedeck. So 2,000 years of the Bible comes together now. The beginning of Genesis, the beginning of the Old Testament, right to the fulfillment of the New Testament. We go down here and we see the high priest entered beyond veil once each year into God's presence, foreshadowing what was going to happen. We go to our next screen. Chapter 7, his name Melchizedeck means the righteous king. He's in line, in oneness with God. King of Salem later evolves into Jerusalem. There's no Jerusalem when Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Means king of peace, and so does the city of Jerusalem. Without father, mother, or ancestry, without beginning or end of life, like the Son of God. Melchizedek, because we don't know where he comes from, we don't know who his relatives are, his bloodlines, or anything about him, is similar to Jesus. He's beyond the limits and boundaries of this world. And remember, the Jews segregated themselves according to bloodlines. The Levites were a bloodline. The Judeans were another bloodline. And it all segregated the community. And you had to be of a bloodline to be a priest. And this goes beyond into the eternal order. He remains priest forever. Now, what is this doing? Paul is preparing in Hebrews for the community to go beyond Jewish leadership of the apostles into a new generation in the church. And the new generation have many Gentile leaders. So justifies Gentile priesthood and leadership in the church, and especially at the Eucharistic banquet. And it also gives form and structure to the liturgy. We don't just have people gathering in Mark's home, or Mark's home for the Last Supper liturgy. We have people going into a bigger community, a bigger order, a temple, a church. And this assembles us, and it gives us a natural structure and form as the priesthood went into the temple in Jerusalem. Now we go on to our next screen. If another priest is raised in likeness of Melchizedek, not by law nor by flesh, but by the power of life, he cannot be destroyed. So Jesus was raised by the power of life, and nobody can destroy him. And this is proved by his resurrection. For it testified, now, this is Latin for you are a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. I put it in Latin because this was always emphasized right up until the 60s, okay? When I was singing in the choir for those being ordained, we blasted this through the cathedral. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. I hope the music is playing in the background for centuries. It was the hymn sung when priests were ordained to the priesthood, and they were to remember that they were in an eternal order, they were entering into a new order, and they were freed from the limits and boundaries of their background. They were confident that God would work through them where they were. Thank you so much.